morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. This first one should be rich and fun. We have some people, I think 6 people have been here before, and 10 of you are brand new, and almost all the speakers, except for one, is brand new. So here we go. Rowan Williams was confirmed in 2002 as the 104th Bishop of the See of Canterbury, where his principal responsibilities over 10 years that followed were overseeing and supporting, as Archbishop, the life and witness of the Church of England. He did this primarily through his own biblical teaching and supporting the church's leaders, those guiding the global communion of the Anglican Church, over 85 million members worldwide. Dr. Williams today is a renowned theologian, scholar, and poet, like Eliza, and he's also the principal author of more than 30 books. He served as a member of the House of Lords from 2003 to 2020, and in 2012, Queen Elizabeth conferred on him a lifelong peerage in the United Kingdom. Many of us may recall tuning in to live stream in April 2011 when he officiated the wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton. Most recently, he served as the 35th, the Americans, that's all we pay attention to.
One thing I may remember for.
They're doing all right. He served most recently as the 35th Master of Magdalen College at the University of Cambridge. Today, he's the Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Theology at St. Maltius College. After this session concludes, Dr. Williams will be leaving somewhat quickly to head back to Wales, where he has, by the request of the Welsh Government, been co-chairing this special commission for the Constitution and the constitutional future of Wales. It's pulling a good bit of his time these days. So we're going to hear first today from Rowan, and then second from Eliza Griswold, who I understand he's known for a good while now. So let me introduce her quickly now too, and then we'll turn to his remarks, and then over to you. Okay. Since 2003, Eliza Griswold has been the religion reporter at The New Yorker, where she covers religion, politics, and climate. She's written 4 books of nonfiction and poetry, most recently Amity and Prosperity, One Family and the Fracturing of America, which earned her the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. She's held fellowships at Harvard Div School, the Guggenheim Foundation, Harvard University, and the New America Foundation. She's the winner of the Lucas Prize, a Penn Translation Prize, and the Rome Prize for Poetry. In addition to her journalism work, she's also this year a distinguished writer in residence at NYU, based in London. So the idea here is, how should we understand the current moment with a theological lens in view? From growing political extremism and polarization to religious diminution in Europe and the United States, how should that motivate people of faith to respond? We asked Dr. Williams to open this time by reflecting on the relationship between religion on the one hand and nationalism, the culture wars, migration, and the fragile state of democracy around the world. Thanks to you both for speaking at Faith Angle. Dr. Williams, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Josh, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this conversation. It's a great delight to be alongside Eliza again. I think the last time we were on the same platform was launching one of your books in Oxford, wasn't it, some years ago? But huge privilege to be with you. As you'll have gathered from that introduction, I've been given a very modest task of describing the global situation in 15 minutes or so. But what I wanted to do was, under those heads that you've just heard, just to reflect out, think out loud a little bit on where religion seems at the moment most obviously to come into public discourse in some quite uncomfortable and complicated ways. We were talking just now about perceptions of religion in the wider world, not least in the journalistic world, and the sensation that is quite widespread that religion is a bit exotic, a bit impenetrable, and potentially very dangerous. All of those may or may not be true, and we'll see as the morning goes on what level of truth there is to that. But I want to look at the context in which some of those perceptions actually arise. And the first, most obvious one is the complex relation these days between religion and nationalism and nationality. A curious fact about the Christian history of the last 100 years or so is that in Europe, mainstream Protestantism has, if you like, withdrawn more and more from identification with nationhood. If you would ask that question, I suppose, up to the 1920s, mainstream Protestant religion, Calvinist or Lutheran, was very strongly bound up with the identity of Germany, Scandinavian societies, the Netherlands, and of course, in a rather distinctive way, the English realm. That is a tide that has ebbed very visibly in the last 100 years. And on the whole, those Christian traditions I've just mentioned have become rather more critical of nationalist identitarianism in the last half century or so. They've become identified increasingly with liberal, globalizing, internationalist perspectives. Rather ironically, the Roman Catholic Church in Europe, which for a long time represented a very solidly internationalist vision, has in many of its avatars in contemporary Europe become more identified with national identities. I'm thinking here particularly of Poland, of Hungary, but also of certain religious trends in the rather less high-temperature Catholic environments of Italy and Spain. The Orthodox world is another matter. Here you have what is, in theory, an international commonwealth of religious conviction and practice with a high degree of homogeneity in liturgy and in other ways. In its public worship and in its hierarchical structures, it's pretty much homogeneous, as I say. At the same time, it has historically been identified since at least the 16th century with national resistance to different kinds of cross-ethnic states like the Ottoman Empire, and has a very particular relationship with the national messianism of Russia. This national identitarianism within Orthodoxy has peaked and troughed at different points in the last couple of 100 years. We're seeing, of course, a particularly toxic peak at the moment in Russia. But it is still to be heard in Romania, in Greece, and other places. But that, of course, means that the Orthodox world is somewhat divided in that a substantial Orthodox population lives still in a minority situation in the Middle East. And as for the United States, well, it's complicated, as they say, but certainly a rather non-traditional form of Protestantism has been very much part of a variety of American exceptionalism, white nationalism, and all that goes with that. I won't comment on that in detail because Eliza knows more about it than I do. We can talk about it later. But the point I'm making is simply the relation between religion and nationalism in the Western world at the moment is varied, slightly more complex than you might expect, and, if anything, getting a little bit more marked in some areas. Very marked, of course, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but also, as I say, in some areas where a particular kind of political agenda has fixed on and instrumentalized the Christian tradition of that particular country. Now, outside the Christian world, it becomes yet more complex. On one hand, you have a great resurgence in the last 20 years in a form of Islamic rhetoric which emphasizes the role of the Ummah, the worldwide Muslim community, over against the incipient nation-states of the mid-20th century in the historically Muslim areas of the world. I was reading just yesterday an online piece which had been circulated by the Islamic Commission for Human Rights in the UK, which is an essay basically saying, and here's something to speculate on, it was an essay by a Muslim scholar from Asia but working in the UK, arguing the problem with contemporary Islam is that it's too Jewish. Meaning by that, contemporary Islam has largely bought into the nation-state ideology. And that is what has to be dismantled. In other words, the war is, I paraphrase, but not very much, the war is not simply against Israel, it's against the internal Israelism of certain kinds of Islam, like commitment to the nation state. Now, there's a very complex set of ideas to work with, but it, I think, dovetails with that particular perception of, as I say, a certain strand in modern Islamic rhetoric, which looks with deep skepticism at the, I think you'd have to say, quasi-nation states that emerged in the 20th century, the states that were created after the First World War, the states which in the 1950s seemed very briefly to represent a movement in the Arabic-speaking world towards something like a nation-state structure. The original Egyptian and Syrian states of that era, and so on. So, just another little complication to stir the pot. And the last instance to mention here, of course, is India, where a particular kind of synergy or symbiosis between religion and national identity has created, I think one can say created rather than recreated, but created a mythical, homogeneous Indian Hindu identity in which every single non-Hindu element is regarded as fundamentally a kind of pathogen in the body politic. And we're looking in India at a rather unexpectedly ferocious resurgence of that kind of national self-perception. Well, I won't bore you with a sort of tour of the world in terms of religion and nationalism. Those are just a few things which, as a moderately informed observer, I spot as I look around when I think of religion and nationalism. But, second point, I'll try to be brief, because the second point is one on which we could all, I guess, enlarge quite a lot. One of the factors that comes into this, as I've hinted at with certain elements in European Christianity, one of the factors here is the role of religion in what are so tiresomely called culture wars these days. The notion that the world is fundamentally divided between warring ethical cultures, one of them entirely dictated, it seems, by something called the LGBT agenda. I'm still a little baffled as to why that should be seen as the global ethical principle on which everything and everyone stands or falls. But there is a gulf between that and something called traditional society. And this particular kind of binary, very much sort of prepared and cooked in the United States, is in some very strange ways being exported to societies which have very little to do historically with the United States. But it is a fact that particular kinds of conservative Christian, nationalist, ethically conservative rhetoric is indeed read and recycled, often verbatim, in Russian and other Eastern European literatures about national identity and the current global crisis. So the culture wars, in the very particular form in which they have taken shape in the United States, have been very successfully exported around the world to configure the kinds of conflict that appear in other environments. And it's very significant, I think, that the Patriarch of Moscow has cast the war in Ukraine in terms which, it's tempting to say, were crafted in Baptist seminaries in the United States. That is to say, the real offense of Ukraine is gay pride marches. Here is the godless West establishing a bridgehead in the historically orthodox world, and Ukraine has to be saved from itself. It has been corrupted, undermined by this aggressive Western modernization, but because the holy city of Kiev is the beginning of Russian Orthodox Christianity, it must be rescued. It is as if putting it very mythologically, Canterbury as a city, or Kent as a county, had closed Canterbury Cathedral and erected a mosque in the grounds. It's that kind of cultural aggression that is configured here. So the alarming rhetoric of Moscow, I think, has its roots there, and it's also rather encouraged by the curious borrowing by the Russian Orthodox Church of the language of militant Islam, whereby Russian soldiers dying in Ukraine are martyrs in an entirely Islamic sense. That is, they have died for the true faith in the zero-sum battle between cultures. So religion is played into culture wars internationally in some rather surprising and, again, rather complex ways. I won't comment on the detail of that, but I note that as something not always spotted in accounts of, for example, the Ukraine conflict, that there is a borrowed rhetoric of both triumphalism and martyrdom, which is picked up to defend this particular aggression. Of course, it draws on that deep Russian tradition of the holy and victimized people of Russia, the people who are always at the receiving end of Turkish, Tatar, Swedish, German, French, and whatever aggression, and yet maintain their faith and their integrity in the face of all that. This great long story of Russian messianism, but it's given a special edge these days by these cultural borrowings from elsewhere. Third, and briefly, the issue of religion and migration. For a great many people in Western Europe, not least in our own society in the UK, issues around migration are very easily elided into issues about religion. The migrant is paradigmatically a Muslim for a great many people in the United Kingdom. And that's part of why migrancy is a problem. This is an alien element imported into British society. This is something which undermines the historic coherence and homogeneity of British society. The historian is allowed to raise an eyebrow or two at this point. But that is part of how the migrant issue is configured. And I think if you asked I won't say the average person in the street, who is entirely a myth, but if you asked a great many people who read the popular press in the United Kingdom, what comes to mind when you hear the word migrant, probably 2 or 3 words would come up. One is illegal, because the political rhetoric almost always ties illegal migrant or bogus asylum seeker together as if they were one term. The second would be probably a word like Afghan or Syrian or something, but certainly a person whose racial otherness is very visible and whose religious otherness is coded into that. Now, that, I suspect, could be reproduced in Germany over recent decades with Turkish migrants, but I leave that to others to discuss because I have no very direct knowledge of that. But I simply note that in the UK, and I suspect in other Western European countries, that's part of it. And you have the irony in Denmark, and to some extent in Sweden, you have the irony of a historically very communitarian, rather egalitarian, Protestant-inflected society suddenly closing ranks in the face of migrancy and discovering that its liberalism is skin deep on that subject. And I've been fascinated to listen to Scandinavian friends talking about their sense of surprise and shock that the mental boundaries have closed so quickly on that subject when faced with larger scale migration than historically they've known. So religion plays into that as well. But finally, because I've been talking far too long, finally a brief comment on religion and the general democratic crisis. And this is having been a bit glum and negative so far, because there's plenty to be glum and negative about. This may be a slightly more interesting and positive take on the situation. There are at least some across different Christian confessions in different political environments who would want to say part of the crisis of democracy at the moment, and I don't think any of us would deny there is a bit of a crisis of democracy globally, part of the crisis of democracy is a crisis of legitimacy. What is it actually that gives a democratic state a credible mandate apart from majority voting? What is it that grounds the notion of losers' consent and minority rights and so forth? What is it that grounds the very notion of a lawful democracy rather than a majoritarian democracy? And into that discussion, which I don't think is going to be wrapped up anytime soon, into that discussion enter questions about what sort of philosophical anthropology, what doctrine of the human we're taking for granted, what grounds the idea of rights, or the converse idea of human dignity, and to attempt to discuss those without at least factoring in the way in which religious conviction and religious practice have nurtured certain ideas of right and dignity, is to cut yourself off from a highly significant source of ethical perspective and ethical conviction. How that's worked out, how religious traditions find a voice in the public space to discuss these questions of rights and dignity in that particular framework of thinking about the foundations of a lawful and credible democracy, I'm not sure. Speaking from within religious institutions, we're not actually terribly good at getting out into that conversation at the moment. And it's partly our fault, and it's partly the fault of a culture which, as I said right at the start, tends to see religious people as exotic, mysterious, threatening, stupid, and all sorts of other things, which means that there's no assumption that you're going to have anything sensible to say. So, homework for everybody here. I mean for everybody here in this issue rather than for everybody here, because of course we all know better. But there we are. That's a lightning dash around a very, very complicated set of issues. I offer it just for a discussion starter. But thank you for listening patiently, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Eliza has to say.
Okay, over to Eliza, who's going to draw out Dr. Williams a little bit, maybe say a little bit of her own. But then after, please get in. If you've got a question, you can go like this, and I'll make sure that you get in a queue up here. And then when you ask your question or make a comment, please just reach to close to where you are and hit that microphone so that others can hear as well. Eliza.
So just to say thank you, Rowan, so much, because what you introduced to us is a form of critical thinking about faith that is so missing in public discourse. And how do we do that? How do we re-inject into public discourse the reality of religion? I mean, I really began reporting on religion, like so many people in my generation, around 9/11, when my editors, that wasn't just the sort of ignorance of the terms within Islam or Christianity, and in particular, resurgent evangelicalism, and which is quite muscular and often violent in the global South. It was the idea of we've grown beyond this, which certainly it's fun to talk about this in France, right? We've grown beyond religion. It's not relevant anymore. This is a matter of, social economy, have and have nots. And so we understand it better than people of faith understand this themselves. And I think, if anything, we've seen over the past several decades that that's simply not true in any terms. And hopefully that's given us some humility in understanding or beginning to be curious about religion in the world in its current iterations. I wanted to back us up for a tiny second, because if you guys haven't heard the recent BBC podcast in which Rowan speaks about Auden a little bit, I just wanted to ground us in something that isn't the matter of the mind for a tiny second and read a quote from Auden's In Time of War. But ideas can be true, although men die, and we can watch 1,000 faces made active by one lie. And maps can really point to places where life is evil now. Nanking, Dachau, we could add Gaza, Israel, Ukraine, and places we've forgotten because we lost, Afghanistan, Syria, and onward. So just to sort of ground us in where this matter really, really matters, and the fact that if we begin with, I wanted to ask you a little bit, Rowan, about if we return to this idea of Orthodox Christians and Christians in the Middle East in particular, and to the reality that in Gaza, the one Anglican hospital was Al-Ali, right, that was bombed, and we've seen the bombing of the Church of Periphorus, I think is, and how this trend of migration and Christians migrating from the Middle East as sort of the death of pluralism, as more a canary in a coal mine than doubling down on Christians leaving the Middle East. But what do you think we're seeing there in the Middle East? Can we start there? We don't need to wade into the lion's mouth, but its edges maybe.
Right. Well, yes, I've been in Gaza in past years. I visited the Al-Ali hospital, recognized the photographs when I saw it, and also the Church of St. Porphyrios. But yes, I think in different ways, the ideal of a homogenized, religiously homogenized society is increasingly taking over in what was historically an uneven but definitely pluralist environment. The old Levant has vanished. I think it's gone forever. I remember my first visits to the region in, I suppose, the late 1970s, when you could still see the legacy of that, as I say, certainly unequal, but also basically tolerant culture where Muslim villages would observe Lent alongside their Christian neighbors, and Christian villagers would observe Ramadan with their Muslim neighbors. The expulsion of Jews from Iraq in the late 1940s is part of that story, and a straw in the wind. Everything in the 1950s that follows from both the struggles between Israel and its neighbors and the last gasps of colonialism in respect of Egypt, the Suez crisis, and so on. All of that is where I think the seeds are sown of the pressure to homogenize. We see it in the rise of a particular kind of Islamic rhetoric, as I've said, which uneasily oscillates between the Muslim nation state and the Ummah, but there it is. We see it in the pressure on the far right in Israel, which essentially is to make Israel an exclusively Jewish state. In certain respects, we see it in the pressure on Christian minorities from both those sources. And I think it's a bit like the Indian situation, a confected, invented past now used as a weapon to push towards, yes, a post-pluralist situation. I think that is part of the story of the region at the moment. And within that, the unimaginable suffering and threat and fear that creates, not only in minorities, but in majorities, threatened majorities.
I love that you say this about because it is all religious reawakenings are imagined returns to a past that never existed, right? We see that certainly within a Christian context. We see that within a Muslim context as well, which are the two that I'm more familiar and more comfortable speaking about. And you talk about this idea of martyrdom, right? And shahid, same root, to witness, that the idea of death has become an act given to God. And that is not just a contemporary idea, right? That is dates to the Crusades, if not farther back. I wonder about this idea of nation state, because what I see, so I spent a bunch of years, that's when we were talking about the first book that I'd written, traveling along basically what's the southern edge of the Muslim world and where the 10th parallel, right? The line of latitude upon which the Brits explicitly split Sudan, making it illegal in 1910 for missionaries to work to the north. I mean, this is really a curious place, all doubled down on climate change. But much of what I think is happening in the global south, and I'd love to hear you speak to this, is that nation states and certainly national lines were arbitrarily drawn by colonial administrators on maps. They never existed on the ground. And religious identity, more than any other tribal identity, is a superpower. And it's not just explicitly local. I'm thinking about Nigeria in particular. But it also gives your kid a right to go to school. You get your electricity, your road, you vote. Everything depends on that religious identity locally and then globally. And this, I'd love to get into this a bit, because talking about the import of this conservative Christianity in America, writ large, which certainly applies in Africa as well as Europe. But so we see this idea of, and Marian and I were talking about this a little bit last night, you see, I have the right to an unmediated access to God through the text, right? I'm born again as a Christian, I'm reawakened, I don't need a priest or an imam or anybody. I can read the text for myself. I can read Deuteronomy that's telling me to stone people. Do you know, there's this superpower to it, because this identity is larger, it's local and it's global, and it's legitimate, right? It has this legitimating factor where the nation doesn't. But it's curious to hear you saying, and I hadn't been thinking about it, about the alignment of religious identity and national identity, obviously, elsewhere, right? Is it right to say that we saw the import of some of these culture wars sort of beginning in the global south and now they're creeping north? Does that sound right?
That sounds quite plausible, actually. I think we've discussed before, and I know you've written about this, the way in which Africa has certainly been flooded by American religious rhetoric in certain ways. I remember visiting Uganda about 20 years ago and going to a Christian university in Uganda, not far from Kampala, with somebody who had taught there in previous years. And he was very taken aback to find that it had been more or less taken over by an extremely aggressive American culture, religious culture. It had an American principal who was pushing very hard for a strict fundamentalist approach in the college, which was very much at odds with the mildly evangelical, social-oriented ethos that my friend had remembered from his day there. So that was just something, another straw in the wind, which brought home to me how that export happens. I think you're right, it is in some ways creeping northwards, and what's happening in Russia, to my mind, is a very interesting index of that. Just as even within the United States, I hear some of my Orthodox Christian friends in the United States talking about the number of converts coming into the Orthodox Church from a fundamentalist background who bring into the Orthodox Church their own concerns and priorities in ways that are quite, destabilizing for traditional and often kind of ethnically inflected Orthodox groups. So yes, I think that is happening. The superpower point is very interesting because it presupposes that religious faith is less about belonging than, as you say, access. It sidesteps the very diverse cultural contexts in which religious faith is actually, as a matter of fact, learned. It markets the illusion that there are forms of religious commitment that are culturally independent, that are culturally cut loose, and that these are the ones that matter, and these are the ones that need intensifying and defending because every cultural set of influences, every cultural configuration is dangerous to the purity of religious faith. Different ways of doing this, but I'm fascinated by the way in which across all the major faiths you have that tension between those who recognize that their religious belonging is always going to be inflected by different kinds of cultural affiliation, and those who say, no, there is a culture-free version of this. It's Wahhabism in Islam. There are versions of it in Judaism. There are certainly versions of it in Christianity. And it's a very pervasive thing. Could I just come back to one other point, which you touched on briefly? It's the martyrdom thing again.
Yeah.
And the death cult element, which comes into that sometimes. That, you might say, is the ultimate expression of culture-free commitment. We don't want to make a difference here. We want to be faithful unto death, yours or mine or both. We don't actually want to change things in a sustainable way. We want purity at the cost of whatever it takes. And that's an element, as many people noted, in the apocalyptic language of ISIS. It's a bit difficult to know exactly what Hamas is up to in that connection. Some people have said, well, Hamas has gone full ISIS in its attack a few weeks ago. I'm not sure. I suspect there's a lot more pragmatism and a lot more Iranian cash and all sorts of things going on in the background than that. But it's a question. And that, of course, can also play into Christian Hindu versions. That's curious double vision of the martyr and the triumphalist hero. Yeah, complicated.
Two things within that I think are essential, and I want to make sure that we talk about India, because I feel that in a room of journalists, we so often, in the hierarchy of horrors we need to report on, we are giving Modi a pass, especially since our tolerance of India's far. The violence and, killing of Muslims in particular is in villages. It's hard to access as a reporter. India is very good at shutting our access down once we begin to report. And we have so much money and power in this diaspora community that I think we really need to go there. But first to talk about...
Well, sorry, just say one word.
Yeah.
Manipur.
Yeah.
Manipur. Off the radar for nearly everybody.
Right?
I've heard first-hand reports from Manipur. I have a dossier from someone whose family is there. Where is it?
There you go. That you're just giving. Here's a source right here. So we will follow up. Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah. But I guess you might agree that it's not exactly got around into the bloodstream.
Absolutely. So I do want us to return to that because I think it's easy to give it a pass. And also, though, this idea, so we're talking about basically weaponizing the idea of persecution. And I think it goes both ways. I mean, both of us, perhaps we will not name the source today, but are familiar with an African bishop who would say, if he were sitting here, Muslims do not have the monopoly on violence in Africa. Right? So what is it? What is the idea? We were talking about this a little bit at dinner last night. How do the culture wars become violent? So this idea, you were talking about the LGBTQ agenda, and I think just to walk that back a step. So we see around the world, and this is really an import from the US, but it's the fear that sexuality, homosexuality, is a Western import. It's neo-imperialist. So the idea that progressive Christians might come to Africa and say, you can be anybody, you can be gay. It's like, that is toxic. It's not just a sin, it's neo-imperialist. You are once again trying to colonize us with our ideas, with your ideas. We've been Christians since 33 AD, so get back, Jack. Like there's this, and it's hard then when that gets grafted onto a legitimate narrative of racism and imperialism to pull those ideas apart. And then it goes back to the United States where it becomes an animating factor of the Christian right. And I did not think about talking that. I'm so tired of Christian nationalism, but I think it's probably important to sort of ground those terms in a little bit of reported reality. So what do we see happening? We see, first to mention Trump and what he did, right? What did Trump do with the idea of Christian nationalism? He essentially borrowed the rhetoric of Europe and stripped the idea of Christian of anything faith. It's just white tribalism. I'm going to say Christian nationalist. It's a dog whistle to everybody, but I'm talking about white people. Certainly, and what that dovetailed with in the US is after Charlottesville, the alt-right in particular, after 2017, this idea of being an Aryan nation was particularly under pressure. You know, the alt-right turned to Christianity and has really used Christianity as a legitimizing force. They are turning up at Christian right conferences, this kind of rhetoric of America as a white Christian nation. And guess what? The sad thing is that it's grounded in our history, right? The Puritan reality, manifest destiny, these are ideas that were based explicitly on making America a Christian nation. So when on the left we say, oh, this doesn't really exist, this is all imagined, the truth is there's enough of it in American history that Christian nationalists can draw on that imagery. And they also read the text. This is fascinating to me. Much of the ground game of Christian nationalism and the way that it is eroding democracy is run deliberately in prayer groups in America who read the Constitution the same way they do the Bible. So the US government is illegitimate, certainly the federal government, but I can read the Constitution the same way I can read the Bible, and I can interpret it for myself. And that means that voting, electronic voting, is completely suspect. Like, the jumps in logic are extreme. They are, in some cases, certainly in Pennsylvania, where I have most experience reporting, run by a retired CIA analyst who most of his career he spent in Iraq. It's an influence operation, right? And we really need to name it explicitly as such. And it's based, I think a lot of what we see, its energy is based on a fracturing within the evangelical world. 1 out of 4 Americans belongs to would consider themselves evangelical. That is really, really similar to a lot of the resurgent Islam we see, this reawakening, where the idea is I have unmediated access to God. I am exclusively saved. So now we're in a binary dialectic of us versus them, which I think inherently leads to violence. So we've got people saying, I know the word of God. If you try to talk to me about it, I know better than you do. And I'm a martyr. If I die for this cause, I'm going to heaven. Why? Because I have the one path to salvation, and it's an exclusive one. Then we see within that, I don't want to draw us into the fracturing of evangelicalism too much. We can talk about it more if people are interested, but I do know there's interest in talking about the jumpsuit I'm wearing in the audience. I want to make sure we stay relevant. Okay, so to return to some questions for you, Rowan, because I really, to think how are these, I think this idea of persecution is worth exploring for a minute. How have you seen Russia adopt this language of persecution as a myth? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I could talk about Russian history and culture for the next 3 hours without a pause very happily, but I'll spare you that. But I think it is an interesting fact that the historical mythology of Russia, especially as you see it beginning to take shape in 19th century Russian history, and a certain sort of 19th century Russian history writing, and a certain kind of spiritually inflected version of that. The myth goes a bit like this. Russia has never had clear boundaries. It's never had an obvious centralized structure. Its basic reality is, if you like, Pacific peasant communes gathered together, perhaps around a city or two. The early medieval Russian myth, Kiev, Rostov, and Vladimir, these little cities with their little cathedrals and their bishop and their monastery, and the peasant communes clustered around. That's how Russia began. Then the Tatars came along and sort of wiped all that out, and the Grand Princes of Moscow eventually drew these scattered communities together by selfless devotion and labor and by selfless submission to the Tatar rule. So a medieval figure like Alexander Nevsky, the hero of that great film, was distinguished not only for defeating the Germans, the Teutonic Knights, in the famous battle on the ice, he was also distinguished for essentially efficiently collecting taxes for the Tatar Khan, because that was his job, to keep people safe. And the selfless, rather inverted commas, selfless role of the Muscovite state in placating the Tatars to keep the Russian people safe, that's part of the mythology. The weakness, the humility of this exercise of power, which accepts foreign rule, certain kinds of foreign rule, and then when the moment comes is able to turn it round, Dmitry Donskoy, the end of the 14th century, and then of course the emergence of the Muscovite state in its full glory. And it's a slightly odd picture, but it's very deep in the Russian narrative. There's a sort of fundamental bagginess about Russian identity, which has to be pulled together again and again. But it can be pulled together only by those who, if you like, sacrifice their own status, their own moral purity, make the compromises necessary, and sometimes other people's sacrifice is necessary, which is why Ivan the Terrible is a very ambivalent figure in Russia. He's a hero in some ways. He's responsible for the modern Russian state. And the fact that the body count is quite high is just an index of how much the poor man had to put his principles on hold while he got things together for the community. Which again is why there are those in Russia who have quite seriously said he ought to be canonized. This is stretching it. But there we are. It's there as part of the story. So Russia is always a victim, but its reaction to its victimhood is a kind of, at best, passive-aggressive response, at worst, a sort of ruthlessness about what has to be done in order to preserve this essentially, deeply, ontologically vulnerable people. So, sorry, I can witter on about this for hours, but I think that is part of what feeds into the story. And that is, of course, what Stalin so successfully animated in the Second World War period, why he turned to the church in 1941-42 as the custodians of this myth of Russian identity. Here we are again. Here are the Germans again. Here is the West again, up in arms against the holy crucified people, the crucified Russian people. So we need the church back in the story. And although Stalin wasn't exactly a friend to the Orthodox Church in certain other ways, again, the body count is pretty high, that was the political usefulness at that point. And Putin can very successfully revive the same story now. And the Orthodox Church now enjoying unimaginable political privilege because of that, in the light of all that story.
Mm.
Maybe let's go one more question, and then we'll flip to you. We've got Karen Tumulty, Yasha Monk, and I think a few others in the queue. So.
Yeah. So just to say thank you, because I know that I can tell by this is an unusually rapt audience. We could listen for hours, but we won't make you do that. And it's thank you so much, Rowan. Why don't we return to India? And because that same idea of like the imagined persecution, of being martyrs forever, right? And the imagined enemy, which certainly has historical precedence. Why don't we ask, what would you like to see from the press what is missing? What would you like the people, what do you want us to do?
It's a very difficult question to answer, really, because I suspect that the people around this table are not necessarily the people for whom I would have the toughest questions, because my worry is about a sort of vast spreading media world in which informed and truthful reporting and intelligent commentary is not necessarily the top priority. And the real issue, which I guess none of us knows exactly how to respond to, is what the controls are. I don't mean controls in the sense of control, but what the criteria are for re-establishing trustworthy communication. We're seeing now in the Israel-Gaza situation precisely the sort of fog of war issue where blame is just flung around repeatedly in a way which is then magnified on the streets. And I don't know where we start with this. I really don't. Which is why one thing I would like you to do is to help me think about it.
That's really helpful. It's very funny, too, that we sit here to interrogate religion, forgetting that you can just flip the lens, and now we're going to interrogate the press, which has culpability in almost every place. To turn it over, I mean, some of the conversations already with the remarkable people at this table, I'm thinking of Yasha in particular, is going to have great questions about identity and whatever. We'll just turn it over. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Eliza. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you both. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. And Josh, how soon is the transcript available? I wanted to ask you.
2 weeks, okay?
Okay. I wanted to ask you about something very specific that relates to a lot of these forces that you have been talking about, and that is the rather peculiar affinity that a number of American evangelicals have for Vladimir Putin. I was thinking about, for instance, right after the invasion, Franklin Graham tweeted, "Let's pray for Vladimir Putin." And Pat Robertson said that Putin was just carrying out God's plan. Where does this come from?
Well, I think this is very much part of that affinity I mentioned between the American Christian right and Russian exceptionalism, and this idea that the fundamental ethical battle at the moment is between the corrupt, decadent, sexualized West and something else, Christian integrity of one sort or another. So the Christian evangelical will see in Putin someone who is supported by a Christian leader, Patriarch Kirill, who is saying this is a crusade against the sexualized, debased culture of the West, taking over Ukraine, ripping Ukraine out of its natural affinities with the Orthodox world. And although the American evangelical may have no interest at all or investment in the Orthodox Church as such, they will recognize the cultural signals, the dog whistles, and respond. Is that fair, Eliza?
The term American evangelical makes me a little uncomfortable because I think we really have to break down this sort of sense of a monolith. Franklin Graham is, particularly politically, he loves sound bites, right? This is the guy who called Islam a wicked and evil religion right after 9/11. I went with him to Sudan in 2003. He's always looking. If his father had a massive, you can't look at the child without the father in this case. His father, as we know, right, was the personal pastor to from Nixon to Obama. And so Franklin will weigh in with something that looks like representative of American evangelicals when in fact he's looking for his own platform. And he weaponizes. At the heart of it, I would say, if you look at within the fracturing, there's a fight for the moral heart of evangelicalism right now, right? Graham represents the wing in which is really pretty much desacralized. I mean, there's a whole, we are going to weaponize politics. We need to. We are embattled. We are being persecuted. We love autocrats, wherever that autocrat is going to be, because that autocrat controls theology. We love this hyper-masculinized, shirtless Putin man on his horse. We're like that. We love John Wayne. You know, think of the Jesus and John Wayne equation. So that's a particular strain within evangelicalism. The one other thing I wanted to say is right alongside it, although Franklin Graham would not stand by this, is this growth that comes largely from the Christian South of this prophetic tradition within, we see this in Christian nationalism, it's very virulent. I'm going to pray, it's prosperity gospel. I'm going to pray for what I want. I'm going to spiritual warfare. This also graphs onto what we're seeing in support for Russia in a very curious way, which we can talk about more later.
And if I could just add one more thing on that. I occasionally look at one or two things in the orthodox American blogosphere just to find out what's going on. There's one particular website which casts all of this very much in terms of Russia's resistance to the Patriarch of Constantinople, who is pro-Jewish and pro-Masonic. And you know that's another strand in a form of religious paranoia, which surfaces here. I just mentioned that as part of the wider picture, because that the conspiracist version, Illuminati, Jews, Freemasons, you name it. That's also part of it, because as we all know, they are the people who are promoting homosexuality and taking children away from their parents.
In pizza restaurants throughout Washington.
Yes, and so on, and so on.
Oh, of course.
Oh, sorry, I forgot the Knights Templar, yes. Oh,
And Build-A-Bear.
Yes.
Can I intervene for 1 second, only because I've written about this exact question. I once compared the way in which the modern American right talks about Russia with the way the old far left used to talk about the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And it's remarkably similar. And the similarity isn't, of course, the systems are different and so on. The similarity is in they use it as a way of criticizing America. Yeah. So, everything's so much better in the Soviet Union because everything's so bad here. And you have a very similar way that the American far right talks about Russia. America is decadent, America is falling apart, look at Russia, it's better. But they've never been to Russia, they don't know what Russia is like. Russia is, they imagine it as a Christian society. In fact, it's, I think, 11 or 12% Islamic. There's a part of Russia that's run by Sharia law, which is Chechnya. It has a very high abortion and divorce rate. It isn't anything like what they imagined, just like the Soviet Union was nothing like what the left imagined. Yep. But this imaginary Russia is a way of criticizing, the home team.
Yes.
And
yes.
it's very similar.
Sorry to delay out the question, as I just wanted to respond briefly to that. Just to say in passing that I believe Orthodox Church attendance in Ukraine is considerably higher than in Russia itself. So not sorry. But there's a very good book by Noel Malcolm on perceptions of the Ottoman Empire in early modern Western Europe. And if you want to see where this instrumentalizing the stranger in order to criticize your own society comes from, it's all there in descriptions of Ottoman society, which is either much more legally efficient or much more religiously tolerant or much more something or other than we are. Nothing at all to do with the Ottoman Empire, everything to do with France, England, or the Netherlands in 1680.
There's a statistic that no more than 5% of Russians have ever read the Bible, which is, we can all agree is very low.
And I think we can't get away from understanding that for the Christian right, what are they looking at? I don't want to draw anything, whiteness is a key aspect. White male identity as Christianity, it can't be divorced from that.
A KGB colonel as a Christian leader is a fine idea.
Exactly. Yash, I think you are, yeah.
Just on this exchange, I think the idea of praising the other when your motivation is hating elements within your society, your own society, is just a basic human instinct. And one other text here is George Orwell's Notes on Nationalism, which is excellent on that. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. If every religious leader in the world was as thoughtful and reasonable as you, the world would be a better place. I understand that one of the points of this conference is to make sure that people like me who are not particularly religiously musical come to understand more about the role that religion plays in society, and I applaud that. I wonder whether we also sometimes are culturally unmusical, whether we also sometimes are tempted to see the world in economic terms or in sort of broad ideological categories of the 20th century, and therefore become overly simplifying in our understanding of disputes over cultural and social issues today. After 9/11, a lot of people talked about, Christians and Muslims and Jews without knowing the difference between Shias and Sunnis. I worry that when we talk about the culture war in very broad terms, we lump in very different, I suppose, cultural tribes in the same way. I'm a philosophical liberal with deep roots on the political left, but I would see myself as being on different parts of so-called culture wars, depending on where we're talking about them and what the collection of issue is. So I would propose that there is what I guess you could call a culture war in places like Poland or Hungary or Russia and probably much of the Middle East and perhaps in India, which roughly speaking depicts, pits a so-called traditionalist conservative against a, more modernist vision of society, right? And so there at issue is things like, should we be tolerant towards gay and lesbian people? Should we want free speech? And so on and so forth, right? I would say that there's also a rather different culture war going on in the United States and Britain and Europe, where the lines are slightly more complicated. Part of that is the same lines. Part of it is people who reject all of those things. But part of it, I think, also pits philosophical liberals with roots on the left, such as myself, against progressive ideology that actually undermines many of those things. So I don't want to start with press bashing quite yet, Eliza. Then we ended up discussing a different conversation. A recent article in the Washington Post from a couple of days ago, I'm going to read the tweet announcing it. 4 progressive teachers in Washington's Mukilteo school district wanted to protect students from work they saw as outdated and harmful. The blowback was fierce. So this article was celebrating these teachers for standing up against this outdated and harmful book, which turned out to be To Kill a Mockingbird. Yeah. And so I think that, that makes me a little bit skeptical about the idea that there's this very easy correspondence in the culture wars between sort of the US debate and then the debates in these other contexts. And so I guess I wonder how we can complicate that narrative. And I'm sort of, I think I'm always, for the reason I started with in remarking on Orwell, a little bit skeptical that what drives certain alliances is really a process of learning rather than a set of shared psychological instincts. Which is to say that even if people cite each other and they quote each other and they encounter each other at conferences sometimes, is what's going on really that one is learning from the other, or simply that each is responding in similar ways to debates within their own society?
That's a fantastic question. I wish we had several hours to discuss just that. Because
if you stay tonight, you can.
No, he's got to get back to Wales.
Got to get back to Wales. and I'm really very sympathetic to the way you cast the question, because I wrote something a little while ago suggesting that part of the problem of the way in which we talk about culture wars is that it suggested we'd forgotten how to talk about culture itself. And culture wars is actually a very poor denominator for what we're talking about, these slightly odd clusters of responses and default settings. And I would agree very strongly that the left-right polarities that most of us have inherited don't map easily onto where we are now with this, especially in terms of progressivism. One of the things that worries me a bit about progressivism as an ism is the idea that all the good ideas which you and I now believe in, and all reasonable people now believe in, are so self-evident that we never had to learn them. There's no history to it. Therefore, anybody who doesn't share those views is deliberately, wickedly refusing to see what's in front of their nose. Therefore, cultural and ethical difference becomes a moral matter in itself. I'm not only right, I'm good. You're not only wrong, you're bad. And progressivism slips rather easily into that. And the overheated moralism of an awful lot of online discourse, especially, I have to say, in my children's generation, rather reflects that, doesn't it? And that's why you have some of these odd alliances or odd polarizations. I'm thinking of some people I know quite well whose strong socialist communitarianism, Orwellian or perhaps Thompsonian socialism, puts them alongside certain conservatives for certain purposes, because they don't want to buy into that highly moralized sense of the self-evident rightness of where we are, which means that any element in the process of learning, like To Kill a Mockingbird, is wicked, because that's not where we are now, and it's, we are now at the obvious self-evident place. That worries me deeply in the whole way in which we construct our moral discourse at the moment, and a lot more that could be said, but I just wanted to say, yes, I resonate very much with that, and I resonate with this question of what do we mean by culture? And there's, as I think you're implying, there may be something quite reasonably and thinkably different, something different as between what an online culture warrior in the United States or Western Europe might say about gender issues, and the assumptions of a South Sudanese or a Japanese person about some of these matters, and you can't just roll it all up into one. It certainly didn't make life easy when I was Archbishop of Canterbury, because as I said, there was a lot of import of the American version of culture wars into the African and global South setting. But at the same time, I was conscious of quite a lot of people of good faith in the global South who were saying, I've no idea what all this is about, and I feel I'm being bullied by articulate, self-evident moralizers from the global North into a position I don't understand.
Maybe name Frank Griswold.
We may name
this
your
may
father,
bring us
my
to a longer
dear
history,
friend.
which is why I report on religion. Okay, over to Marion.
Thank you so much. I think I'm gonna make one comment and then a question, and just to tie together things like identity, nationhood, and migration. I think one of the ways in which the culture wars have become less neat for Western Muslims is the emergence of right-wing Muslims in the US, who are as animated by the LGBTI issue as those on the Christian right. And I think right-wing Muslims is a ill-fitting phrase, but it does a job. And these are Muslims who I think maybe until about 3 weeks ago would have been very happy to vote for the Republican Party and also to bring Trump back into power. because they see the world in which both the Democrats and the Republicans on foreign policy share views which they find problematic. So let's vote for the party in which will secure our children's future, will make sure the textbooks are in line with what we believe, and there's lots of mobilization among American Muslims on this issue. So I think that's one way where the culture wars have changed, because there is to some degree strategic alliances between parts of the Christian right and Muslims who are middle class and born in America and identify as Americans. But these are also Muslims who are not nationalist in the classic sense of those on the Christian right. And for the first time, I'm hearing educated middle-class Muslims in the West speak about hijrah, which is the migration that the Prophet Muhammad did from Mecca to Medina because the Muslims were being persecuted. And you have a phenomenon where Muslims in the West, who were born and lived in the West their whole lives, are professional and rich, are now speaking about leaving Western countries because of not the intolerance of Islamophobia or the post 9/11 securitization, but because of the LGBTI issue, as something that is truly existential to what it means to be and live in the West. And maybe just finally, what's interesting is the countries they would like to migrate to are countries like Turkey is top of the list, but it's not Saudi Arabia and it's not the UAE, because these Muslims also have very hostile relationships to these autocratic countries, which they identify as part of the, maybe I don't want to use a Christian term, but the original sin of Arab nationalism, so they identify with the caliphate, with an ummah. Yes. And one of the reasons that they don't like the UAE or Saudi Arabia is because sheikhs in these countries promote a degree of political passivity where they tell Muslims you cannot rebel against your leaders. Being Muslim is not about protesting. Even in the current environment, you have sheikhs in the Middle East saying do not go out onto the streets to protest in favor of, for the rights of Palestinians. Do not boycott Western companies in your countries because you're harming your own economies. So these are like young, sometimes I think predominantly male Muslims in the West who have a very particular worldview, which I think actually contravenes so many of the classic ways we think about how culture wars in the West work. So Muslims are kind of operating in a very different space where they're trying to find alliances and see certain parts of the world as for themselves. So that's just a comment on maybe just sort of broadening out everything that we spoke about, you guys spoke about at the beginning. And then just finally a question. Because of the conflict in the last couple of weeks, what I've noticed is like the sense of millenarianism is back. Yes. Among people who are really watching this conflict and are of a religious affiliation. And how much are you seeing that when you think about, I guess for Eliza, when you think about the Christian right, and how much is millenarianism actually really important in understanding what's happened to monotheism in the 20th century and people who feel like they have returned to religion because the world is about to end?
Just quickly for the timing. Okay, so it's adult learning. There are restrooms just down this hallway to the right. Well, let's answer this question, and then we'll take a coffee break, and we'll come back with one from Catherine Bendel at the Berlin office. But please.
Right. Thank you, and thank you so much for that insight about the right-wing Muslim thing. I hadn't fully registered that, but it's really interesting. It fits in a number of aspects of the narrative, doesn't it? Millenarianism, yes. I do see that element coming to the fore. And what, of course, is, to put it mildly, problematic about millenarianism is that it's not particularly invested in getting anything better, because things have to get worse because they get better. And worse means the end of civilization as we know it. So pulling down the roof on everybody's head is something which certain people in Israel, certain people in Gaza, certain people in the United States all see as part of a reasonable response to the situation. It's probably more acute now than it's been for, I would say, 20 or 30 years, because it was around in the last days of the Cold War. Not just the last days, but it became a little bit more marked, didn't it, in Ronald Reagan's presidency, a kind of millenarian flavor in the language of resisting the evil empire. And millenarianism is always, at least binocular, two perspectives. On the one hand, the good times are definitively coming, and the righteous will be definitively vindicated. On the other hand, part of that story is that things are going to be pretty grim for everybody else, and possibly for you in the process. So I don't think it's a view which is, if you like, believed in by huge numbers of people. But it shifts the moral climate somehow. It shifts the air you're breathing. And if you look at the thousands of people demonstrating about Gaza in the streets, I would say the number of those who would sign up to a full-fledged millenarian philosophy, this is the last battle is coming, and the last push is necessary. The number of those is pretty small, but you can create a fevered extremity of expression by feeding that into the supply, so to speak. And the result is a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, a kind of ethos in which making a practical difference in the foreseeable future is just not interesting any longer. And that means the death of civic virtue. And that's a problem. Sorry to prolong this when everybody wants coffee and rest breaks, but just one other thing. I was speaking on Friday alongside Daniel Chandler of the London School of Economics. Some of you may have seen his new book called Free and Equal, which is a terrific reclamation of John Rawls as a political thinker for our time, saying nobody's really understood John Rawls. We've all got him wrong. We think he's some sort of individualist apologist for 1950s political stasis. And Dan argues there that no, Rawls is actually a really serious political thinker for our time, partly because he knows the difference between civic virtue and moral virtue. He doesn't rule out moral virtue. He says your important moral commitments are always going to be shaped by culture in certain ways. What you've got to work at imaginatively is what civic virtue means, whereby, in Rawls's famous theory, you imagine the society you would like to see if you didn't know what place you'd have in it. You shed your existing privilege, your existing position, and say, well, what if I were blindfold projected into a society, how would I want it to work for me? And he says that is a very serious account of the basis of civic virtue. Bracket my actual belonging, my actual conviction. Not because it doesn't matter, but because I've got to imagine what a civic virtue is like, which allows me to live with a neighbor who is not the same. Let go of that, and you have majoritarianism, and you have totalitarianism, the lot. So those of you who haven't seen Dan Chandler's book, it's well worth reading. It's very beautifully written, Free and Equal.
Josh, can I speak for 60 seconds? Just very quickly on the point about millenarianism. My parents became born-again Christians in the 70s. And looking back on that time period, the book, The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, was a bestseller during that period. It didn't really impact our church that I grew up in. We didn't talk about this a lot. But as I traced our culture and the way it impacted me, the impact was everywhere, even though we didn't talk about it all the time. So I think you're exactly right about that.
Just to then this question about how much does it animate certain aspects of American evangelicals. I would say it's the motivating factor for most of Gen 6 for a huge, is it dangerous or is it not? There's just the explicit linkage between these Jericho marches, biblical references to bringing down corruption in order to bring about the end of the world, and what motivates a very small but very willing to be violent group of the population looking for authority. Is that helpful? And yeah, this is, the rapture, we could go on with a pop culture reference that has created these ideas, the Left Behind series, that's created foot soldiers in this movement for sure.
Okay, guys, we've got 50 minutes, and we want to get in as many questions as we can, and we're going to work really hard to do that, okay? First out of the gate is Katrin Benhold with the Berlin desk at New York Times. We've got Jafar, Bart, Nick Casey, Joris, Mark Weitzman, I think two others, Christina Lamb. So Katrin, over to you.
Wow, lots of people. I'm going to try to keep it short. Thank you very much. Oh my God, is this?
That was me, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. It's like my computer is talking at me. Thank you both very much. It's been fascinating. as somebody who's covered the far right in Europe and in particular Germany for the last several years, I just wanted to point out something that's maybe obvious to a lot of people here, but obviously that alliance between the Christian right and the far right in America, which has been so powerful and in some ways destructive and such a threat to democracy. What surprised me in Europe, where church attendance rates are much lower, is that there as well, the far right is trying to instrumentalize Christianity, but the churches are actually empty. So what I've observed, especially in Eastern Europe and in Eastern Germany, is that a lot of these marches by neo-Nazis take place outside of big iconic churches in Dresden, for example. And the next day in the newspaper, you will see that picture of the march with a church in the background, but the church is empty. I also observed that there is a sort of near perfect symmetry between the people who sort of, if you draw a map of Germany, who claim that sort of legacy or history of white Christian Germany for themselves, and far-right voting rights, they overlap on that map. There's a near-perfect symmetry between that and actually the godlessness of those regions. So, for example, Eastern Germany is very secular. Hardly any church attendance rates. Churches are usually used for other purposes. But that's where this claim to that Christian history is strongest. Similarly, there's a near-perfect symmetry between anti-immigration sentiment and actual immigration rates. Again, in Eastern Germany, you have very low rates of immigration, but you have very strong anti-immigration sentiment. So what I've observed in my reporting is that this is all happening in somewhat of a vacuum. And I'm wondering, in other words, people are spiritually actually not very Christian, but they clearly have some kind of spiritual emptiness in their life that they're trying to fill with other purpose. And I'm wondering to what extent, and this is my question to you, Rowan, to what extent the moderate sort of force within the church could come up with a counter narrative that is powerful enough in this vacuum to give these people something that might stop them from running after the demagogues. Because the demagogues are operating in, are actually not talking about real things. They're talking about, for example, immigration. I mean, if you look at the map of Germany where these anti-immigration sentiments are very strong, the real reason for a lot of the frustrations and insecurities is emigration, is that a lot of people have left those regions, especially the young people. And so people feel quite threatened by migrants, even though those migrants are not actually coming to their regions. So I guess very concretely, what do the moderates within the churches in places like Western Europe, what can they contribute to the debate? And perhaps just to add a little bit of spice to the debate, what would be your one-line response to somebody who is bringing up this LGBT issue as the major front line in this culture war? What can you say as a representative of the church to counter that, to debunk it, really, as a sensible front line?
Right, so how do we evangelize Europe again in half a minute? Thank you. Just for what it's worth, my sense in the UK is that something of what you describe in Germany could be mapped onto the UK situation the same way. There certainly has been an attempt to instrumentalize religious imagery and discourse by some bits of the far right in the UK, but I think it's fair to say that there isn't a religious right in the UK in anything remotely like the sense there is in the US, though some people would quite like to see it. And the traditional conservative movement at the moment, just beginning to gather steam in the UK, does have some rather fishy affiliations there, and are asking some rather strange people to speak to it. I'll just say Jordan Peterson and shut up. Yes, allergic reaction there. So the two questions. I think there is a fair amount of energy going on in some less reactionary Christian circles to produce a narrative. I think the frustration experienced by a lot of Christians is that, partly because of the sexuality question, that's the narrative most people associate with the church. This is where the tangles and standoffs and dead ends occur in sexuality. The church is tied up with that, and it doesn't have energy for anything else. I don't think that's true, from my experience. I was saying Mass in our local parish church yesterday morning, where I help regularly, and listened at the end to one of the congregation talking about the Christmas appeal for the local hostel for homeless young people, which we support weekly. And I think there's quite a strong narrative in that parish, as in many others, about all those aspects of local society which wouldn't exist without the volunteer contribution of the churches. I wish we could tell that story more effectively in public. We don't. And it's partly our fault, it's partly, I think, the fault of an ingrained narrative about this in our society. On the LGBT plus question, I think the thing I most want to say to those on the conservative side of that debate is perhaps to quote from St. Paul when he's talking in the letter to the Romans about the temptation to mutual condemnation in the church, where he says that I don't interfere with somebody else's work for their own master. They stand or fall to the one they think they're responsible to. Can we imagine people trying to be responsible to serve the Lord they believe in, even if we think that won't do? But, it's not my place to dictate the response of another to the truth we both try to serve. That's where I'd start. 10 years as Archbishop of Canterbury told me that, well, not to hold my breath about the results I was saying about, but that's where I begin.
Can we flip next to Jafar Abdul Karim from DW? Yasha's maybe. Yasha, can you help with that one?
I can talk now.
Okay, good. That's great.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to say I'm very happy to be part of this. It's my first time, so looking forward for the next days, and thank you for the invitation. And my question is, like the last weeks, and more the last week, especially in Germany, I've been thinking about one question which is being asked within the society is, should Muslim communities, should Muslim organizations in Germany distance themselves and condemn what the barbaric attack on Israel happened by Hamas? Why I'm asking this? Because I was on Saturday, I was in Berlin covering the pro-Palestinian protests, and I realized that a lot of migrants are asking themselves, why should we do that? Because if we distance ourselves from something, means we were close to it, and now we have to distance ourselves. And on the other hand, they ask themselves, is it a kind of doubt in us that we are not European, Western enough because we have roots somewhere else? And that's why in this situation we are seen not being part of the society, including who we are. And I would really like to know your input and your perspective on that. What's the right approach? We talked yesterday about it, Delphine, because this is, I find like this is a criteria. If you don't do it, then, okay, I don't know if it's gonna be a dialogue, but you have to do it, and then we can keep on talking to each other. What's your input on that?
Yeah. So, in effect, you're saying that condemnation of Hamas becomes a kind of admission ticket for credibility in German society.
Yeah.
And people don't want to sign up to that. But I'm interested also by what you said about the assumption behind it that unless you condemn it, you must be complicit. That's a problem too. I fully recognize the pressure on Muslim communities like that. I can see it in the UK as well. And I think there's a fine line there. I've seen enough online and not just online, of people who are speaking very explicitly in defense of or in favor of the Hamas incursion. And I guess that host societies are just going to be extra suspicious because of that. It's just a fact of the political scene. I wish there were more people who could simply step out from the Muslim community and say to the ambient society, this is our problem here. If this is going to be the test by which we're judged, just, be aware of how that's impacting on us and get it out there as an issue. Because nobody's thinking particularly clearly or particularly freely about this. The pressure, I suppose the counter-pressure that some feel, and I'm aware of some Muslims in the UK who'd say this, it's as if unless we are out there demonstrating for Palestine, we don't count as Muslims any longer. We lose our credibility. And there are those who've written quite forcefully about the Hamas incursion, who have had the full weight of disapproval from their own communities falling on them. They've had the death threats too. So it's not an easy situation at all. And I don't have a solution. I wouldn't want to say to any community, this is what you ought to do. I would say that it's important to foreground that particular kind of tension and say, look at the power relations here. The question you always have to ask, what are the power relations? Who actually has the leverage here? And if you're giving the message that this is an admission ticket for credibility, just step back and think again. But how you get that discussion going, I don't know. I think the way you've put it is powerful and for me helpful in framing that.
Maybe we can stay within the UK and go, and Rowan that is, and go to Christina Lamb, Sunday Times. And it may require borrowing this same microphone.
Actually, you and I were just talking about the whole issue of collective guilt, and maybe you could discuss that a little bit, following on from Jaffar's question. What I had wanted to ask you was, we've been talking a lot about the sort of intersectionality between religion, politics, and culture. What you think the role of religion and the church is? Is there a political role for the Anglican Church? And the other thing I wanted to ask you was where you see Christianity in the Middle East now, because obviously over the last 20 years we've seen a huge exodus. I think the population's gone down from 20% to less than 2%. 2%. And in some of the places that were the very birthplaces of Christianity. And do you see any way to turn that around, or you think you just have to accept that?
Well, let me answer that second question first, and say I'm not optimistic about Christians in the Middle East. I think that the variegated pressures that have been building for the last 20 years, point in one direction only. And that I find rather heartbreaking. These are communities I've known for decades, spent a lot of time with, and love very dearly. I think they've played an important, crucial role in the cultural life more broadly of the region. And I don't see much future. And many of the people I know in the middle of it don't see much future. Just thinking of Greek Orthodox Palestinians in Israel, at the bottom of every heap. They're Arabs, so they don't rise to high positions in the church. They're Palestinians, so they have an issue with Israel. They're Christians, so they have an issue with Muslim neighbors, and Muslim majority Palestinian communities have got increasingly intolerant of Christians in the last 20 years, an uncomfortable fact, but it's there. So, they are some of the people I feel sorriest for, right at the bottom of every imaginable heap in that setting. So, no, I'm not sanguine. I fear that Western policies in the last 20 years have made the position specifically of Christians harder in so many of these areas, because Christians are cast as Western agents, in effect. And I remember with a kind of groaning of spirit, a couple of conversations I had with members of the government in the early 2000s about the Iraq incursion, realizing that these are people who have actually no idea that there are indigenous Christians in the Middle East. and therefore no idea of the risks the risks they are exposed to by particular kinds of Western language and Western action. Anyway, that's my worry. Anyway, the Anglican Church, especially in the UK. It seems to me that one of the jobs of any church in a society, and I'm thinking back to what you were saying, Radek, over coffee, about the way in which Christianity, having been a totalizing and dominant religious culture, has had to get used to not being that. So what do we do now? Well, the role of a church is, I think, to hold up, if you like, an imagined society. To keep saying, what would a society be like if it were actively, consistently mutual rather than competitive? If it were actively and consistently welcoming rather than exclusive, if it were actively and consistently committed to the restoration of relationships when broken by selfishness and sin, in religious terms. Holding up that vision, that language, say, well, what would a society like that look like? You're not it, says the Church Society, and we're not it either. But the difference is that we have the vision which we want to keep putting before you as something that's not impossible. That's the kind of minimal contribution I think the Church has to make in any society. And I suppose in variously uneven and confused and ineffectual ways, that's what the Church of England tries to do in various contexts. And I think back there to the one occasion when I felt I was any use at all in the House of Lords, just the one, when the bishops managed to help overturn a government regulation in the last days of Tony Blair's government, a government regulation licensing super casinos in Manchester. It's a small thing, but the government was proposing liberalising laws about super casinos. And one of the sites involved was a working class area of East Manchester, which, as it happened, I knew rather well, because I used to have correspondence every year with children in a local primary school. One of the things they did in this church primary school was write letters to the Archbishop of Canterbury once a month. Wonderful. It really was one of the things that kept me going as Archbishop. So I knew a bit about them. I visited them. They'd visited me in London. So, we were there in the House of Lords, able to say, 3 bishops present that day, including the Bishop of Manchester, we know the community in which you are proposing to license super casinos. We know the economic pressures that face this community. We know from first hand the effects on children and young people of a culture which, frankly, already disables and disadvantages them. Why do you think liberalising gambling regulation in a community like that is going to be good news for anybody at all? And we won, to my abiding satisfaction. 3 votes, with 3 bishops present. So, that's just a little glimpse of what can sometimes be done in holding up. 26. But they're not all there on any one day, because, we have day jobs. But I'm not particularly committed to defending bishops in the House of Lords as a matter of general principle. But if they're there, that's the kind of thing that they can be useful with.
Nick Casey with the New York Times Magazine, Madrid.
Hi, yeah. Rowan, we've been talking a lot this morning about culture wars in the West, and I'm wondering if you think that there can be such a thing as a pacifist in a culture war, a conscientious objector. That's to say, even if my side wins, that it will do irreparable damage to all else. The problem is as much the war itself as it is the enemy. What would that path look like? Mm-hmm. Who is doing it now? What does Christianity say about this itself, being, in other wars, a producer of big pacifists and that movement?
Brilliant question. There is actually an essay by an American essayist called Greg Wolfe called On Being a Conscientious Objector in the Culture Wars. So you might look that up. Greg I think he identifies as a pretty conservative Christian. He's a Roman Catholic. He was the editor of that really first-rate religion of the arts journal called Image. And he wrote this essay a few years ago, saying very much what you've just hinted at, which is, I really don't want to define my Christian identity in terms of winning this battle, because it's not about battles and not about winning. There are things I feel, he would say as a conservative Catholic, I feel I must witness to. But the counterproductivity of witnessing in a way which annihilates an ongoing relationship with another, that's not it. So I would say it's very important for anybody from any religious background, I speak as a Christian specifically, to say, if you hitch your wagon to victory in this, if your faith becomes tied up with this, if your Christian identity becomes bound to this, then beware, because you will diminish that identity, that integrity, in the process of secularizing your faith into yet another political standoff. So I think there's a lot to be said for a kind of conscientious objection there. I mentioned I'd been trying to write a bit about this here and there, and did a lecture called Beyond Tribalism a couple of years ago, trying to tease out the way in which we, as religious people, can very readily be sucked into this zero-sum, high-octane, high-temperature sense of, my faith is not worthwhile unless I'm making the laws. And whoa, that would have sounded very strange in the ears of quite a few Christians across the centuries. But it's interesting to see that also in the context of a revived or reinforced interest in some bits of the United States in a kind of theocracy. There's a small but very vocal group of Catholic theologians who are, if you like, backpedaling a bit on the Second Vatican Council, saying, well, the ideal is an explicitly Catholic society in which Catholics make the laws, because we're right. And if we're right, then this is what we've got to do. And if we're right, this is what everybody's got to do. And you're back to this question of what I call civic virtue earlier. How do you cope with the fact that the people you disagree with are not just going to drop dead? I think that's one of the most basic questions you can ask in politics, and indeed human society generally. What are you going to do if the people you disagree with are still going to be there tomorrow morning? It's the loser's consent question, it's the anti-majoritarian concern, it's the minority rights issue, it's the civic virtue world. And if that's abstaining from the culture wars, well, I will go to the conscientious objection tribunal along with others and defend that. That's an ideal.
Can we go to Joris from Amsterdam, previously London, post-Brexit, went back?
I hope this works, yeah. Yes, my question actually picks up on that idea of what do you do with people who disagree with you, because are the cultural wars really new? Or is it just that we now find ourselves on the defensive in the culture war, and so we become aware of it? So I'm thinking of my grandfather, my opa, and I would often find him in tears over abortion laws, because he felt there was a new Shoah going on. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Same with euthanasia. And he all but excommunicated his daughter because she was lesbian, and it broke his heart. Mm. He very nearly excommunicated me because I wasn't baptized. Mm. And so if you were alive today, you'd ask him, has there been a culture war? He says, yes, it's been going on for decades. I've been dismissed and ridiculed. My political positions were never taken seriously. And almost everything was arranged through the courts. So the right to abortion, it was always done through the courts. So I never had a chance.
Very good point. And I think that the sense of being left without a voice in this is part of why we see this pushback in so many ways. And as you implied, the progressive or liberal element is more on the back foot than it was 20 years ago in this respect. I'll come back to that in a moment, but just to pick up your particular point about the courts. This interests me a lot because I think we're now largely in Western Europe, and perhaps North America as well, in a culture where we will very readily seek to solve problems by legal rather than cultural change. Change the law, and we've changed. Actually, we haven't. And if, I used to say sometimes in church circles, if it takes a bit longer to change this, but the change is owned when it happens, it's worth waiting. Now, because we're very impatient as a culture, we don't particularly want to hang around and wait for cultural change, so we pass a law and people have to catch up with it. And I have very mixed feelings about that. I can see why people want to pass laws because of protection, essentially. I also feel we're neglecting the cultural hard work that goes on behind this. And that may connect a bit with some of what Yasha was saying too, and others around the table. So that's one of the things in my mind here. Second observation, just coming back to where we started, and whether cultural wars are new. No, in the sense, of course they're not. And I can remember, fierce debates when I was a teenager about some of these issues. What's slightly different is two things. One is, of course, online discourse and the way in which that trades on polarization, necessarily feeds on it. You accentuate the exclusiveness of the position in order to keep the funding coming. Second thing is, connected with that, we're perhaps a bit more inclined to think of our moral commitments, and this again relates to things other people have said, to think of our moral commitments as a package deal. If you are liberal on this, you must have this position on another matter. And James Mumford, who's an English essayist and journalist, has written a book called Vexed, V-E-X-E-D, Vexed, which deals with the problem of vexed questions and the way in which we respond so often by bundling together a whole set of doubtfully consistent principles as our tribal flag. And I think that's become a bit more marked. So if, let's come clean here, if somebody like myself has a liberal position on LGBT plus questions, but morally rather than legally speaking a rather conservative position on abortion, that's really not allowed. I look with interest on really radical gender activists and free speech advocates marching for Palestine with the possible sort of background sense of Hamas can't be that bad, when Hamas's record in terms of women's rights and freedom of speech is, not particularly impressive. And I wondered quite what's going on in the mind there. I'm not wanting to ban marches or anything like that. I'm just asking a question about what exactly is going on. And I think the complex process by which you assimilate and agglomerate moral positions as the necessary set of beliefs. Yeah. That's a slightly worrying factor. We ought to be able to think intelligently about ethical questions in their own right, and say, well, there is a case for this, which I accept in the terms it's laid out. I don't see that as necessarily carrying over into a set of convictions about another issue, which I don't then have to think about. And anyway, I won't witter on, but you see what I mean.
Mark Weitzman, Tablet, France.
Yeah, I'd like to come back on the question of millenarism. It seems to me that at the backdrop of the whole context and the discussion, there is the notion that apocalypse, the notion of apocalypse at some point in the middle of the 20th century left the field of speculative theology and became a technical possibility. And that changed everything in the way we see religion, and religion defines themselves. So in the West, the reaction to that was the invention of a sort of benign nihilism, if you will, based on consumerism, the sexual revolution, and personal freedom, and the idea that you had to invent, each of us had to invent a meaning for his or her own life. But the basis for that, the unspoken feeling for that was fear and guilt. It's something that the what we call the South, or certainly the Islamic world, did not know. There was no fear. There was certainly no guilt at all. And so millenarism, it seems to me, there are two different definitions of what we mean by millenarism. There may be an optimistic version of millenarism, for instance, in the way the West tried to homogenize the world in the 90s. Mm-hmm. This was a utopia, a millenarist utopia, according which you could get rid of the tragic aspect of millenarism. You could invent a millenarism without destroying anything. But this failed. And now we're back to a sort of much darker vision of what millenarism is about. And it implies destroying everything. So I was interested in what you said before with the when you spoke about the religious the way the Russian reintroduced religion during World War II. When you listen to what the Hamas leaders say to justify what's going on in Gaza, the way they sacrifice their own population, for instance, they explicitly mention Russian sacrifice during World War II. They say Russia sacrificed 23 million of their citizens during World War II. Why wouldn't we be able to sacrifice 2 or 3 million Palestinians in order to get rid of Israel? This is apocalypse, according to me. You destroy everything. And it has a certain appeal, even to the far right in the West. In France, at least, when you mentioned what the way the far right is trying to find some sort of religious appeal, but the churches are empty in East Germany. So are they in France. So what's been happening in France? We had to face a terrorist wave during the last decade. You realize that the far right is beginning to see the jihadists as a kind of model. Half consciously, they see the Islamists as people that are able to sacrifice their own lives, in the name of their faith, and that's becoming a kind of, that's what we should do. That's the thing to do. That's how we're going to regenerate the Western world. It's not really a question. It's just a kind of
Thank you.
A few remarks.
A really, really helpful observation. I think that the whole idea of, if you like, secularizing apocalyptic language is part of the history of the last 150 years. I used to work on a Russian writer who spans the pre- and post-revolutionary periods, Sergei Bulgakov, who was a Marxist who became a Christian and was eventually ordained as a priest and wrote some very important theological works. And Bulgakov, I think in the first decade of the century, wrote a long essay about Marxism and apocalyptic, mm-hmm. in which he analyzed the ways in which theological tropes were being sort of fed into the political world. And he wrote another brilliant essay in that period on the sort of mindset of the far left in Russia in the first decade of the century, saying, this is actually not about anything except the performative declaration of the coming end of the world. And he'd been a deputy in the Second Russian Duma and describes how the far left had systematically undermined liberalizing measures in Russian society in the name of this maximalist vision of the coming end, which absolves them from any kind of decision-making in the near future. That's certainly there, isn't it, in the mix in the political history of the last century and more, and it's around today. And if you like, feeding that back into the religious world, well, yes, that's exactly what the sacrificial language says. This is about the coming final vindication when there will be no more negotiation to be done. And if that final state can be brought about by various kinds of catastrophe, by genocidal violence of this or that kind, well, so be it, because it's worth it to be right. And against that, I always think of that wonderful statement ascribed to Martin Luther. If I knew the world would end tomorrow, I would plant a tree.
There you go.
In other words, you can't absolve yourself from the question of what is the life-giving constructive act that now I'm called upon to perform. And I apologise for getting to a pulpit on this. I think that is one of the most important things we can ever say to ourselves or anybody else. What here and now is the life-giving act I'm free to perform. I'm not absolved from that. Not absolved from that. Sorry, Eliza, I've been rabbiting on, not letting you get a word in.
Please, what are we here to listen to? It's fascinating. I think the only thing that I would say to add to that is that the millenarianism development in the US that has shifted is a school within Christianity called dominionism, which holds, the shift is we are now, it is our job as Christians to actively bring about by taking over the instruments of the state, as opposed to we're going to wait until this happens and Jesus comes back. I have an active role in taking over the media, the government, and marching around the Capitol to bring the walls down. So that's different. And that's 20 years. The dominionism is decades older, but its popularity and its power is tied to this prophetic movement that we're seeing within evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, John Ward writes about that in his new book, Testimony, worth a look as well. And I would only add that there was only one or two Christian professors at Harvard Divinity School when I was there. You know, you were there later on. But the one Christian professor who was there when he had fielded questions about amillennialism, premillennialism, postmillennialism, it was complicated and there was a lot of fervor in the room. He stepped back and he said, I'm kind of a pan-millennialist. Mm-hmm. We said, what's this? And he said, well, I figure you do the right thing and it'll all pan out in the end.
That's very Harvard Divinity School.
Bart Walensky from Poland.
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to, change a little bit of perspective and focus on developments in Central Europe. One of typical trait of these newly formed authoritarian regimes, which are being formed in Poland, in Hungary, and hopefully in Poland, the development was stopped 3 weeks ago by the elections. But the trait was that reshaping. There was a clear reshaping of a phenomena we call the alliance between the throne and the altar. So the church started to be a political factor, official political factor, very tightly connected to the government, even subordinated to the government, and there was a reciprocal relations. The church was given money, privileges. Due to pressure of the church, the Constitutional Court of Poland issued a total ban on abortion, for instance, in 2020. And for that, church vocally supported the authoritarian government, the nationalist government, in many aspects of political life, but also remained blind in areas where the church should be vocal. I mean, the refugees, I mean, the hateful, vindicative propaganda of the government. They tackled the issue of LGBT in a most violent way. One of the leading cardinals of Poland compared gay and lesbians to Bolsheviks. But on the other hand, they ignored the problem of social inequity, of poverty, injustice, and so on. And my question is, because everything will change now, hopefully, in Poland, but the question is there any way to save the church in Poland? Because the visible effect of this alliance between church and state was rapid secularization of the country, which used to be one of the fortresses of Catholicism in Europe. Well, the Pope John Paul II was Polish. There was also a reason for that. And now we have a record decline in numbers of churchgoers. We have the record decline of number of newly ordained priests. Is there any way to save the church in Poland? Or the church in Poland is simply, for that what has been done in this last 8 years, simply condemned for a demise? Thank you.
Thank you. I know the Polish context very little, so I can't guarantee any sense from my response. But I do make the comparison with the church in Ireland and the overnight destruction of a sort of Catholic default culture there in connection mostly with the abuse scandal. And I don't think the Catholic Church in Ireland has begun to recover from it. I don't think it's impossible to recover if the Church is capable of admitting its own failures. There's the difficult thing. It's not just about polishing up the image and saying we're not as bad as you think, or we've changed. It is also, I think, a matter of saying very publicly, we got certain things wrong. And that's hard. Because that is, putting it bluntly, that is a spiritual issue. The capacity to say, I was wrong, I need forgiveness, is, it's a rather basic religious impulse, which is one of the toughest things imaginable. And I say that from within a church which has had to cope with its own abuse scandal and say its apologies in public about it. But it's harder, I think, with some of what you describe in Poland, because it's not just about the abuse scandal, it's also about a set of variegated political options. And it's about that basic question, which Eliza really touched on just then, what kind of power and leverage should the Christian community have in politics? And I can recall a conversation I had about 15 years ago with Cardinal Schönborn of Vienna, somebody for whom I've got a great affection and respect. And we agreed on the formula that it was important for Christians to be visible in social and political debate, and important for them not to be dominant, visible and not dominant. Now that's a position that you have to think through. And if I were implausibly asked for advice by anybody in the church in Poland, I would say, can you rethink along those lines, visible and not dominant? Not wanting just to withdraw and say, oh, it's all too difficult, we're going home. But to say, we want to be around in the argument, and we are not assuming we have to win.
I think the word that Rowan is dancing around but not saying is repentance.
It's very much so, yes. Yes.
Just one quick word to Nick's question about the Christian pacifism. I mean, there's a concept of, I'm not promoting it, it's problematic in its own way, but this Anabaptist idea of the third way, rooted in Scripture, is that Jesus refuses dialectic and dualism, so that like there's the example often quoted of John 3:16, when the adulterous woman, the elders bring this woman who's committed adultery to Jesus to kind of trap him in like, well, the law says she must be stoned to death. What are you going to do, teacher? And he kneels down and writes in the dirt, right? And no one knows what he writes. And maybe he's just doodling to like get the elders to chill out. What is he doing? He's posing a creative solution. So, and then he says, let those among you who's without sin cast the first stone, right? So the idea is the elders have to reflect on their own complicity in sin. But it doesn't end there, that they walk away and they leave the woman with Jesus, and he says, go and sin no more, right? So that the sin is real, but so is the mutual owning of repentance. And that the idea behind it is not that Jesus is just peace and love, which can be hard to put teeth into, but that here is in a Christian witness an idea for a third option. Does that make sense?
Can I ask Radek or Anne, do you want to say anything about the condition of the church in Poland? Maybe a precursor to this afternoon a little bit, or?
Talking about quotes from the Bible, I once talked to a Polish priest, because we have a scandal of abuses, about Jesus actually pronouncing the death penalty for abusing. I forget the exact reference, but if you were to hurt one of those little ones, believe in me, it would be better to have a millstone fastened to your neck and thrown into the deep. That seems to me like a definition of the death penalty for pedophilia. And this priest said, oh, no, that's just a parable. The Polish church will not change quickly. into the sin of pride, very, very deeply. These are people who entered the church in the 1980s, when the church was slightly persecuted because of communism, but actually built more church buildings than in the 1,000 years of political Christianity before. And when it was really fashionable to become a priest, because John Paul II was the most famous Paul ever. And these people think that this is the model. You know, we are martyrs and beneficiaries at the same time, and we represent the best of Poland. And you just kneel before us and do what we say. And you know, generations pass, and in conditions of freedom, it doesn't work like that. And so what they want is unsustainable. And before they come down to earth, they need a lot of recollections, they need a lot of penance and other things.
I would just...
Sorry. It's meant to be. Think of this next comment as coming down from above. Yeah.
No, I would just underline the direct link between the Polish church. When I moved to Poland for the first time in the late 1980s, the church was a neutral, beloved institution that belonged to everybody. And even if you didn't go or you weren't Catholic, you sort of respected it because of its role in Polish history and fighting communism and so on. And the church's decision about a decade ago, 15 years ago, to become affiliated with one political option, one political party, changed really radically how people thought and felt about it. And so something that was kind of like apple pie, you know, part of the background, suddenly became part of the political debate. And so if you didn't like that political party, and this is the Law and Justice Party, which has just lost the election a couple of weeks ago, but ruled Poland for the last 8 years, if you didn't like that party, you stopped going to church. And particularly since that party is very unpopular among younger people, there has been a decline, largest anywhere in the world, I think almost ever, in church going. So from being a very high level, it's gone. So I think it's still relatively high, but the drop is remarkable. I mean, sort of percentage points every year. And there are now, younger people who would kind of automatically have gone to church, just don't do it anymore. And so I don't know whether there's a lesson for other churches in other places, but it was a kind of radical mistake, and I'm amazed that nobody in the Vatican ever stopped them or said, why is this happening?
Sorry.
A Catholic journalist put it rather well. I think there may be a lesson in it for other churches in other countries. Namely, if a church marries a political party, when that party loses power, it becomes a widow.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful.
It's actually a version of a statement which I think was made by an Anglican cleric about 100 years ago, who said, if you marry the spirit of the age, be prepared to face widowhood. But it comes to the question, really, what does the church, or indeed any religious institution, want to be associated with in the public mind? If church means a certain set of political options, then the church, or whatever religious institution we're talking about, ceases to be a place where people can access resource for meaning and hope wherever they're coming from. And I don't...
If I could just interject, the other thing that is going on right now in the Catholic Church that is extremely important is the debate going on among the bishops about whether to embrace or reject Francis, and where he is trying to take the church. And certainly you see that with the US bishops.
And let's get one more from Matt Kaminsky alongside this, okay?
No, I think you have a lot of Polish voices here, but that might be overrepresented. But I think it was actually, it even predates that, because it was remarkable in the late 80s when we were all there, is that there's famous Michnik quote, the church taught us to only bow before God, and that was such an important, it played such an important institutional role in the fall of communism. But I thought the church really, this predates even the founding of the Law and Justice Party, that it was almost not as dramatic as in Ireland, but the fall came in the early 90s when there was this sort of, the church thought that they had the mandate to rule the country, and even early on there was this, we did not take down the Reds to be ruled by the blacks, and I thought that the church really kind of strayed even 30 years ago, and it sort of hasn't really, maybe now it's starting to internalize that, the cost of that, but it's been going on for many decades.
Just a brief comment on Karen's point. Speaking from a non-Roman Catholic perspective, I find it a matter of rather wry observation that the people who were most vocal about the infallibility of Benedict XVI's least utterances, every sneeze was authoritative, are now exactly the people who say that the most authoritative pronouncements of Pope Francis can be disregarded because they're not in accord with proper Catholic orthodoxy. In other words, and this is a general cultural point, the paradox of modern traditionalism is that it's an option among others. Living in tradition is living in an awareness of an ongoing stream of understanding and practice, which you don't have to defend all the time. When you become a traditionalist, it's one among other things, and you've got to fight for it. And that paradox doesn't seem to be foregrounded enough in some people's minds. They're unaware of the irony of what they're saying. Here are these ultra-traditionalist Roman Catholics saying that the most traditional central feature of inherited Catholic faith, the authority of the papacy, is less important than their own commitment to traditionalism by which the Pope can be judged. It's another way in which culture breaks up and fragments in our environment. But again, I could go on about that, but it strikes me, as I say, there's just a touch of schadenfreude in my Anglican observation of the way in which the Roman Catholic Church is becoming just as much of a mess as the Anglican Communion.
One sentence on Francis, if I may. The Polish Church hates him so much that there were actual prayers at one of the Catholic universities for him to join his father's house, which is to say to die. And now he's lost the liberals with his insane comments on Ukraine.
We have a friend of this group, Pete Weiner, who was going to be here last year and is an advisor alongside a couple. And he basically says, because this is the most theological session of this conference, right? We have an actual
real one.
An actual theologian, a visual aid.
But he says his experience of the Trump years, people choosing a church because of how the pastor views Donald Trump rather than what they think about communion. People saying in response to lines that are from Jesus, I don't agree with that because Trump doesn't agree with that. And people say, well, it's from Jesus. And they say, really?
Dear foreigner.
Right. He says it's
Jewish, of course.
It's right. It's sociology really that's happening, cloaked in the language of theology. Is that how you see some of this?
Absolutely, yes.
One last comment from Yasha. It's got to be quick, and then lunch is waiting for us across the way. But let's get one last quick.
Oh, no, just very, very briefly, because I was thinking of a possible parallel to the debates between evangelicals, and I was thinking of Pete, but I was also thinking of people like David French, who are very concerned that evangelical churches in the United States have married a political figure in the kind of way in which the Catholic Church has married a political party in Poland. And I guess the optimistic thought, since we haven't had many of those today, that comes from that is that in the end, evangelical Christianity in the United States may, in its excesses or in its politicized versions, meet the same fate that the Catholic Church now seems to be meeting in Poland. I don't know whether or not that parallel holds, but there's, I think, an obvious danger to the influence of the evangelical movement in the United States. They've maximized it in the short run with their alliance with Trump, but that may actually start to erode it in the longer term.
I think, Yash, I think there's a point to that. I think the erosion, the fracturing of evangelicals far predates Donald Trump.
All right, maybe a closing comment from Dr. Williams.
Thank you. I'm sorry I've got to rush off so abruptly after this, because it would have been wonderful to have more informal conversation, to hear from so many other people. I've learned a lot in this exchange. I've really valued it. I suppose at the end of the day, all I really want to say is that the challenge that any religious institution faces at the moment, Christian or otherwise, is a challenge to be serious about God. And that is, if we are serious as Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, whatever, about the divine, we ought to be free to say, that means we don't have to win. And when we're free from that obsessive concern about winning and power, something happens which, to myself as a religious person, is grace. If you're obsessed with winning this war, then you're obsessed with your own capacity to enforce. And that means you don't really believe in God. And I would quite like religious people to believe in God. Thank you.